This video is for Mathlinks, Chapter 4.1, Grade 7, Mentally Finding Percents of Numbers. Okay, so in the book, we're going to learn how to calculate percents of numbers. And the first one the book tackles is 50% of a number. How do we do that mentally? Well, that's pretty easy. So let's say this rectangle represents the number, let's make it easy, 80. Okay, $80. This is representing, the whole thing is representing $80. Okay, so if we want to find 50% of this, so 50% of $80, what that really is asking is for, this is 0%, this is 50%, and this is 100% of the number. What it's really asking for is what is half of 80, and half of 80 we know is 40, so half of $80, or 50% of $80 would be $40. That's 50%. So really, when we're looking up 50% of a number, we're really looking for just half of a number. That's all it is. So if it was something a little bit more complicated, like 50% of 4250, what we do is we take half of each number. So we can say, well, 4250 is really made up of $40 plus $2 plus 50 cents. So instead of thinking of as $42.50 as being one number, we think as being all three of those numbers, $40, $2, and 50 cents. And then what we could do is just take half of each. So half of $40 is $20. Excuse me. Half of $2 is $1. And half of 50 cents is 25 cents. So then what we could do is then take all three of those and add them together, and we'd have $21.25, which is half of 4250. Okay, that's kind of an easy way to get half of a number mentally. It's just to kind of take half of each place value. But another one they need you to do is be able to calculate 25% of a number. Okay, and for that one, if we use that same rectangle to represent, let's say, the number $80, right? So this whole thing represents 80, and we already knew before that 50% was, I'm going to put this $80 in a different place. 50% we already knew was $40, but 25%, this is 0%, this is 100%. 25% is really half of 50%. So 25%, another way to think of it is either is a quarter, which is 25 over 100, you know, a quarter being 25 cents, a quarter, 25 over 100, or just a quarter. So really when we think about this whole bar, this part right here is really a quarter of the whole number. So since we know that 50% was $40, 25% must be half of this amount, half of 50%, which means that 25% of $80, 25% of $80 is half of 40, which is $20. Okay? So when we think about 25% of a number, we're really just thinking about half of half. That's pretty simple. Okay, so if you had that other number, let's go back and look at a different one. Let's say I want to do 25% of, let's do something different, $42.80. Okay. So again, I want to find 50% first. So 40, this is really $40, this is really $2, and this is really 80 cents. So we're going to get 50% first. 50% would be $20, $1, and 40 cents. But like we said before, 25% is half of half. So if I take half of each of these, I'd have 10. I'd have 50 cents, and I'd have 20 cents. Add those three together. 25% of $42.80 is $10 plus 50 cents plus 20 cents, or $10.70. Okay. We simply divide each place value in half, and then we take half of each of those, and then add them together. That's how we calculate 25% of a number mentally. The third one the textbook wants you to be able to solve is 10% of a number. And 10% of a number is actually probably one of the easiest ones to do to find the answer, but it's kind of a complicated one to kind of understand what it means. So 10% is really 10 out of 100, 10%, or in lowest terms, 1 out of 10. So it's or we could say a tenth. So So 10% really represents a tenth of a number. And if I go on that big number again, I say this is $80. I'm going to put it there, put it over here. So this whole thing is $80. This is 50%. This is 25%. This is 0%. This is 100% of the number. 10% is really a tenth. So I'm going to take a different color here. I'm going to divide. I'm going to first erase these lines here. Let's get rid of all these lines. I'm going to divide these and get rid of these two. Let's just do the whole thing over again. So I'm going to take this whole thing and I'm going to divide it into 10 parts. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines make 10 parts. So if this is $80, then this would represent 10%, right? So 10% is really a tenth of $80. If we were thinking about how much each of those bars would be if it was 80, there's 10 of them. So each of these bars must be $8, right? Each of those bars must be $8 because $8 times 10 is $80. So a tenth or 10% of $80, 10% of $80 is $8, or a tenth of $80 is that. Okay, so 10% is really easy. But how do we get it without having to think of it as a big rectangle and dividing by 10? Well, the easiest thing we can do is think about when you divide a number by 10. So if I take a calculator here, and I take the number, I'll bring it over here. If I take the number 80, and I divide it by 10, it's 8. And really, when we think about what that means is, if I put a decimal here, when I divide by 10, I'm really just lessening it by a place value. So 80 becomes 8.0, or if we're talking about money, 8.00, or simply $8. So when we move the decimal one place to the left, we get 10% of a number. Let's look at a different one. Let's take it, if I took $42.80, if I wanted to know what 10% of that number is, I could divide it by 10, or I could simply take the decimal and move it one place over, and I would get, let me erase this decimal here, I would get $4.280. Since we're talking about money, we usually don't use the third decimal place, so and since it's a zero, it's called an insignificant zero. So 10% of $42.80 is that. If we take a calculator again, you go $42.80, a tenth of that would mean dividing it by 10. We get $4.28. So the easiest thing for 10% is just think about moving the decimal one place over. Okay? And then 5% of a number is the only other one you really need to know how to do mentally. And 5% of a number, if I think about that 10% again, so I'll take this and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9 lines make 10 sections. This is 10%. If I was to cut 5% in half, or 10% in half, this fraction here, as a fraction, there would be 20 parts. There would be, I'll put a little green check mark inside. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then 10 more. That would mean that there are 20 parts, and 2 of them are shaded in. All right? Oh, this is not actually what I wanted to do. 20 parts. But if we think about those 20 parts, 5% is 5 out of 100, right? 5% is 5 out of 100, which if I reduce it down to lowest terms, is 1 out of 20. So that 10% that was before, this one right here is representing 1 part out of 20, which represents 5%. 5%. So 5%, in essence, the easiest way to think about it is half of 10%, right? The easiest way to think about 5% is simply what is 10% and what is half of that. So if I'm thinking about 5% of $42.80, the easiest way to get there would be say, well, 10%, we already figured it out. 10% is $4.28. So 5% would be simply half of that. Half of $4.28 is $2.14. So 5% of $42.80, we could think of it as being $2.14. And let's go back to our drawing over here. If I was to take this red line out again and think about that 10%, that whole 10% of the number was $4.28. If I put that line back in, right, half of that would be $2.14, which is what 5% is. Okay, so those are the ones you want to have in your arsenal for calculating mental math. You need to know 50%. I'll just skip the page here. 50% is half. 25% is half of half. 10% is a tenth. A tenth. And you just have to move the decimal. Move the decimal one spot left. And finally, 5% is move the decimal. Is half of 10%. Okay? Those are the big four. Actually, there's one more, and that one more is actually not in our chapter, but I'm going to teach it to you anyway. It's 1%. And if we think about 1%, if I was to take our circle here and divide it into 10 parts, 1, 2, oh, that's going to be too small. Let's go back and erase that. Erase it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9 parts make 10 sections. This I'm going to do in a nice little pretty green. That's 10%. But if I was to cut it 10 parts this way, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now instead of having 1 part out of 10, I now have 100 parts, right? 100 parts. And this one right here is 10% divided into 10 parts, which makes 1%. So that is 10%. The green was 10%. And if I divide that into 10 equal parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, then 1 part out of 100 would represent 10%. So really, 1% is this, which equals 10% divided by 10, okay? Or 10% of 10%. So really our rule for this would be, it's very simple. If we pretend that whole thing was $80, let's pretend this whole number was $80. Not 80%, $80. Then if I want to find out 1% of it, I want to divide it by 10 and then divide it by 10 again. But really, I want to divide it by 100 to get 1%. Okay? And if I take $80, take my calculator again here. If I take $80, I'm going to put decimal zeros there just for fun, and I'm going to divide it by 100, I get decimal 8, 0.8. But since we're talking about money, I need to put an insignificant zero there, and I'm really talking about 80 cents. So each of these squares here, this square here would be 80 cents. And if I multiply each of those 100 squares by 80 cents, I would have the full amount of $80. But how can I do that simpler? Well, for 10%, our rule was move the decimal one spot left. For 1%, all you simply have to do is move it 2 times left, and you'll have your answer. So let's look at it a little bit more complicated. Let's look at 1% of, let's go with $42 even. Okay, 1% of $42. So if I take my calculator and I go $42 divided by 100, because that's 1/100th, I get 42 cents. But if I simply took my decimal, this one here, and moved it 2 spots to the left, 1, 2, I would still end up with 42 cents. Okay? So there you have it. There's your 5 numbers you need to know. I'll go back a couple pages here. We have 50%, 25%, 10%, 5%, and finally, your new one, which is 1%. And the rule for that is move 2 places left. Okay, now with this information, please make sure you watch the next video on calculating any percent mentally using these 5.